Oh, you're right.
Top rung, man.
That's right.
I'm close.
So this is a very expedited markup.
Yeah.
Well, depending on.
I know.
So they're on blocking the bills in two chunks.
What's that noise? Yeah. The quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Committee is meeting today for consideration of many bills, H.R. 5074, the DHS Cyber Incident Response Teams Act, H.R. 5089, the Strengthening Local Transportation Security Capabilities Act of 2018, H.R. 5081, the Surface Transportation Security and Technology Accountability Act of 2018, H.R. 5099, the Enhancing DHS Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program, H.R. 4176, the Air Cargo Security Improvement Act of 2017, H.R. 5094, the Enhancing Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative Act, H.R. 5131, the Surface Transportation Security Improvement Act of 2018, H.R. 5079, the DHS Field Engagement Accountability Act, H.R. 4227, the Vehicular Terrorism Prevention Act of 2017, and H.R. 4467, the Strengthening Aviation Security Act of 2017. Chair announces that any requests for recorded votes will be rolled, and he may recess the committee at any point without objection. So ordered. The committee planned to consider H.R. 4627, a bill authored by Mr. Donovan. However, we are going to postpone consideration of the bill. An amendment was filed to H.R. 4627 that we are seeking more information on and requires additional time to properly vet. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. This morning, our committee will mark up 10 important pieces of legislation to strengthen the security of our homeland in several key areas. When Americans pick up the paper, turn on the news, they are constantly reminded of the many dangers that confront our country. They come from Islamist terrorists, radicalized individuals here at home, nation states engaged in cyber warfare, and many other nefarious actors. As these threats become more lethal and varied, we must exhaust all efforts to stay one step ahead. Over the last few years, we've seen terrorists shift their tactics to kill innocent people in the West. Cities across Europe, London, Stockholm, Barcelona, Nice, and Berlin have all been the location of attacks by vehicles and homicide. Unfortunately, these attacks have not been relegated to foreign cities. Last October, 8 people were killed in New York after a terror attack. Terrorists drove a pickup truck along a crowded bike path. Less than 2 months later, another terrorist set off a pipe bomb by the Port Authority bus terminal. Jihadists are clearly answering Sheikh Adnani's call to kill by any means necessary wherever they are. The threats to our homeland do not end there, however. We know from the airplane bombing in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2015 and the sophisticated plot to take down an airplane in Australia that our aviation sector remains the crown jewel of their targets. We also know that nation-states engaging in cyber warfare are constantly hacking away at our critical infrastructures, including our election process. Russians attacked the election of 2016, and it was meant to create division among the American people. We cannot allow any foreign adversary to undermine our democratic institutions. If we allow a foreign government to sow discord in America, we are letting them achieve their goal. Foreign interference in our elections must never be tolerated. We must do more to protect ourselves from these invisible attacks. Fortunately, we're taking action on all these fronts. Today, the bipartisan legislation that our committee will consider will help strengthen our aviation and cargo security, protect the public from vehicle terrorism, and bolster our ability to respond to dangerous cyber attacks. These bills will also take important steps to better secure our surface transportation systems and enhance the capabilities of our fusion centers. This committee has set a high bar for others to follow. Currently, we have 68 bills sitting in the Senate and 6 public laws. I'm pleased to report that our Senate counterpart finally is marking up our DHS reauthorization bill as I speak. I am hopeful that they will begin to consider more of our legislation at future markups. I'd like to thank everyone here on both sides of the aisle who have worked so hard on these bills that we have passed and now are considering today, and I look forward to working with each of you as we fight to keep our homeland safe. And with that, I yield back, and the chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today the committee is considering 11 bills. While I do not have any major concerns with the measures on the roster, I am profoundly disappointed that this committee is not showing leadership on one of the most significant threats our nation faces, the threat to our election systems. Yesterday marked the start of the 2018 federal election cycle, with your home state completing its primary, as well as your 86% vote in your primary. When it comes to protecting our democracy from interference by Vladimir Putin's hackers, we do not have a moment to waste. The intelligence community has spoken with a unified voice about this Homeland Security threat. In fact, last 6 months, intelligence agency chiefs issued a dire warning about the Kremlin's ongoing efforts to influence the U.S. elections. Even though you have written to me that you recognize the severity of the threat, I'm disappointed that you've failed to exercise leadership by not holding a single hearing on election security. And while we both know that this threat is real, all you've said, too, is that you're willing to allow members to question the new Secretary of Homeland Security about it at a budget hearing that has yet to be noticed. You and I both know that a budget hearing with the Secretary of Homeland Security is not a forum for a focused discussion on this critical issue. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Chairman McCall dated February 21st.
And without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Further, Mr. Chairman, I wrote to you to request that this committee take urgent action and mark up H.R. 5011, the Election Security Act, a bill co-sponsored by over 60 members of Congress, including all the Democrats on this committee. The Election Security Act is a product of the Congressional Task Force on Election Security, a forward-looking initiative that recently issued an oversight report with wide-ranging recommendations to protect election security. I strongly believe that this committee is duly bound to act on H.R. 5011, not only to uphold our obligations to our constituents, but also to carry out our responsibilities under Rule 10 of the Rules of the House of Representatives. For that matter, pursuant to Rule 10, we owe a duty to the House to come together on a bipartisan basis to force Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to answer for his failure to spend any of the $120 million we earmarked for efforts to counter foreign meddling in our elections. And I repeat, Mr. Chairman, we've all been briefed about the threat to our election system time and time again by all our major intelligence agencies, but we haven't done anything, and I just think we have to. Last week, the head of the U.S. Cyber Command testified before Congress that he had not been directed by the Trump administration to go after the Russian attackers. Yesterday, the Director of National Intelligence evaded senators' questions about whether the White House has specifically directed him to address the Russian threat. The DNI stated that there is no coherent strategy to address Russian interference. It seems as if the Trump administration and this committee, under your leadership, are putting the same amount of effort toward this indisputable Homeland Security threat, none whatsoever. While I'm disappointed that the committee missed an opportunity to address election security today, I'm pleased that the committee is considering 3 bills that would bolster Homeland Security in a meaningful way. Authored by Vice Ranking Member Ms. Watson Coleman, H.R. 5131, the Surface Transportation Improvement Act of 2018, seeks to significantly enhance the department's efforts to protect surface transportation systems. It does so by driving DHS to, among other things, ensure that terrorism risk associated with surface transportation receives needed attention in DHS resource allocation process, engage with surface transportation operators about their unmet security funding needs, and explore integrating innovative processes and technology into surface transportation operations. The second measure, H.R. 5089, the Strengthening Local Transportation Security's Capabilities Act of 2018, was introduced by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Barragan, to enhance the ability of local officials and responders to respond to a transportation security incident, such as a vehicle-borne attack on commuters or an active shooter situation like LAX experienced in 2013. And as you know, you and I both attended a hearing at the airport after that shooting. I authored the third measure, H.R. 4176, the Air Cargo Security Improvement Act of 2018, to ensure that TSA is positioned to address the evolving threats to air cargo. The air cargo-based terrorist plot that Australian authorities thwarted this summer was a wake-up call for greater, more focused attention on air cargo security within TSA. As the author of the landmark 9/11 Commission Act, it has been disappointing to see an erosion in focus on air cargo within TSA since publishing its air cargo security rule in 2019. Enactment of H.R. 4176 should make TSA respond more effectively to emerging threats to air cargo security. And Mr. Chairman, you also referenced in your comments that the Donovan bill was pulled for more information, and I'd like to just say that, as you know, we have some rules and we try to work on them, but I understand the fact that perhaps more information is needed. And if I can, do you have any idea on when we might get clarification on it?
Yes, and I appreciate ranking members' points. we're postponing consideration because the amendment was filed that we're, again, seeking more information on, requires additional time to properly vet. I can assure you, as a father of 5 children, ensuring our kids are safe at school is really a top priority of mine. In fact, I just was meeting with my colleagues prior to this, talking about several proposals being put forth by members of this committee to deal with the gun violence issue at our schools. And I'd like to work in a bipartisan manner to move forward with legislation out of this committee. I give you my assurance, and you can take my word on that. I would also urge that we pass the bipartisan Fix NICS bill that was passed in December of last year, which would fix FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check system to make sure, as a former federal prosecutor prosecuted gun cases, to make sure all the data is properly registered in the NICS system, which it is currently not. I think that should be voted on by itself. It would pass unanimously out of the Congress, out of the House and Senate, and be signed into law. And I think that'd be a great step forward. I'd be remiss to say, though, that what happened at Parkland I view as a failure of law enforcement, because the sheriff had 45 notifications that were not heeded. You had a school resource officer that did absolutely nothing outside the school and was a real, to the victims, I understand their anger at that. In addition, the FBI had a notification from their hotline with a YouTube video with this man, Mr. Cruz, this boy, saying he was going to be a school shooter. And the FBI did nothing to respond to that. Absolutely nothing. Dropped the ball, just like, sir, you and I experienced in the Boston bombing attacks, the failures of the FBI. And so I think we have several issues here with respect to hardening soft targets at schools. Schools are soft targets, and they need to be hardened in this nation. And there are proposals out there that I'd like to work with you, sir, advancing through this committee. In addition, the failure of law enforcement, perhaps having a hearing on that as well. I yield back.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the chairman's agreement to work toward that, but also I think we need to come up with some timely hearings so that we can fashion legislation that's appropriate. It was Ms. Demings' amendment that I think created some issues, and she has spent a career in law enforcement, and I think it was that passion that she crafted the amendment, and it was in that spirit that it was put there, but it was also consistent with existing rules within DHS. So it was not anything beyond trying to make sure that DHS and FEMA and other entities follow the regulations. And if it's okay, since she is the maker of the proposed amendment, I'd like to see if she has any comments.
Well, I have tremendous respect for Ms. Demings and her professional experience prior to Congress, and I pledged to work with you on this amendment. It was, as I mentioned, it wasn't. It was filed at the last minute. We just need to more time for consideration, and I pledged to you that I'll work with you on your amendment. And I yield to Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Of course, as you know, I came prepared to offer my amendment today, but of course that will not happen. And I've heard you say that we need more time to study this issue. The Parkland shooting, I'm still grieving over Pulse nightclub, but the Parkland shooting was on February 14th, which was almost a month ago. And the administration, nor this committee, nor the body of Congress has done anything to make this community, our nation, safer. A few months ago, Mr. Chairman, we sat in this very hearing room and we discussed the Urban Area Security Initiative program and the critical need to expand the list to include cities like Orlando and San Antonio and others. And as you know, we are still fighting that fight and seeking funding to do so. Yet again, this Congress has chosen to avoid delay this critical debate regarding how we spend our precious DHS dollars and making sure that those dollars are used as intended. Why have we chosen to do so today, to postpone this debate? I just clearly do not understand. I don't understand why we need more time, because I'm trying to figure out if we delay to a different date, what will have changed? We still have 17 people who have died. What will have changed by the delayed date? The overwhelming majority of the 17, as you know, are children who, because of the failure of this body over the years to do anything, they have taken to the streets and taken to the airways and taken matters into their own hands, and we are so proud of them. For years, it has been FEMA's policy to prohibit the purchase of weapons, weapon accessories, including ammunition, through Homeland Security grant funding. But we also know in the past few weeks, President Trump has repeatedly expressed an interest to arm teachers, and at least one governor thought that was a great idea to come and use DHS precious limited dollars to do so. Mr. Chairman, I'm worried about that, and I would expect you to be too. This debate will not be easier if we delay it to some future date. Matter of fact, it only gets tougher when America continues to watch us fail to deal with the most immediate and critical issues facing us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I think the gentlelady and I respect your points, and I think, as you noted, it is a policy that this UOSI grant money is not used for the purchase of firearms, and I look forward to discussing your amendment further. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for that, but it's in policy. We're trying to codify it in law.
Yeah, and I completely understand.
Thank you very much.
So, ranking members.
Just to make sure we get the record correct, Mr. Chair, the amendment was filed in a timely manner. It was not late.
We received the Ledge Council version in less than 24 hours. So, again, I look forward to discussing this with you, Ms. Stimmings and Mr. Thompson.
I look forward to working with you.
And let me also say on the Russian meddling in our democracy and our election, I've been very consistent in my position. When you and I received the Gang of Eight briefing last October before the November election, I came out very strongly condemning Russia, saying we should call out Russia for what they did and that there should be consequences to the meddling in our elections. I am concerned, based on briefings I've had, that they are now going to attempt to do the same thing in the midterm 2018 elections and impact members of Congress sitting here in this room. It's a very serious issue. I take the issue very seriously. We will have the secretary, we'll have the head of the cyber security agency, if you will, that we have tried to bolster through legislation and prioritize their mission, testify before this committee on this very issue. We are not in any way trying to avoid the issue. I want to take this issue head on. And so to the ranking member, I look forward to working with you to conducting a full hearing on this issue, as it not only was a real event in the last presidential election, but I believe it will be a real event in the midterm 2018 elections. And whether you're a Republican or Democrat, I think that's irrelevant. I think this is a affront on our democracy from a foreign adversary and none of us in this body should sit on the sidelines and do nothing. And so I promise to work with you on that.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you as soon as possible.
I agree. I agree. The other members are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record by agreement. The chair and ranking member and the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object. Would the chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster?
I thank the gentleman, all committee members, for agreeing to the use of amendment roster. We've agreed that bills be open to amendment at any point. We'll take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster, excuse me, out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by the House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. Additionally, it's my understanding there's a bipartisan agreement on a number of bills and the amendments thereto. Accordingly, the chair will be asking unanimous consent to consider these bills en bloc at the beginning of the markup in the interest of time, and the members with bills included in the en bloc will still be recognized for a statement on the bill.
I thank the chair for this explanation and withdraw my reservation.
I thank the ranking member. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 5074, H.R. 5089, H.R. 5081, and H.R. 5099 be considered without objection. So ordered. Clerk shall designate the bills.
H.R. 5074, H.R. 5089, H.R. 5081, H.R. 5099.
Without objection, readings dispensed with. The respective subcommittees are discharged. Bills were circulated in advance. Printed copies are available. No amendments were pre-filed. Does any member have any amendments to these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 5074, H.R. 5089, H.R. 5081, and H.R. 5099 be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, I will recognize myself for a statement, and then Ms. Berrigan, Mr. Katko, and Mr. Estes may each be recognized for 5 minutes on their legislation. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. On the DHS Cyber Incident Response Teams Act, strengthening America's cybersecurity is absolutely essential to protecting our homeland and keeping our country safe. From nation-state actors to rogue cyber criminals, our adversaries are turning digital breakthroughs into digital bombs. With tens of millions of Americans relying on their smartphones and computers for personal and professional use, everyone, including all the members in this room, are a target. Our adversaries do not just look at private networks or individual laptops as they try to bring great harm to our country. They also put America's critical infrastructure sectors in their crosshairs. These sectors include our financial services, healthcare systems, dams and water, wastewater systems, transportation, telecom, food, agriculture, and energy production. All of them play a vital role in making America work, and each one is vulnerable to an attack. Between 2011 and 2013, Iranian hackers attacked dozens of U.S. banks and even tried to shut down a dam in New York. In 2015, we learned that Chinese hackers gained access to 80 million current and former members and employees of Anthem Healthcare. In 2016, we learned of Russian attacks on our electoral process. And we also had 20 million security clearances stolen from the OPM. We must take action to address foreign meddling in future elections. And as I said in my opening statement, their goal is to divide us, to sow discord, and undermine our faith in America's democratic institutions. We cannot let partisanship cloud this issue. Fortunately, this committee has prioritized several cybersecurity missions at DHS in a bipartisan way. Through the CISA, which the House passed by voice in December, we are elevating and making operational the department's cybersecurity and infrastructure protection offices. As part of the department's first ever comprehensive reauthorization, we adopted an amendment that prioritizes and requires DHS to provide voluntary assistance to state and local election officials in recognition of the importance of the election infrastructure. These were important bipartisan steps that we took on this committee, and we're going to do more today. My legislation, the DHS Cyber Incident Response Teams Act, will codify and enhance the cyber incident response teams at DHS. These teams within the NCIC at DHS will provide, upon request, assistance to asset owners and operators following cyber incidents, including with election infrastructure. These teams may also include cybersecurity specialists from the private sector, providing DHS flexibility to call upon outside expertise. This kind of collaboration between the public and private sector, I believe, is necessary to keep our homeland safe in this dynamic threat environment. I look forward to passing this bill out of our committee and our continuing efforts to strengthen America's cybersecurity. And with that, I yield back. Does any member wish to seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Berrigan
I would
is
like to be
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 16 years after 9/11, terrorists remain intent on attacking transportation systems. In recent years, terrorists have focused on relatively soft targets, such as surface transportation systems and public airport areas. For example, in 2013, a shooter opened fire at a TSA checkpoint at my home airport, Los Angeles International Airport, killing TSA officer Gerardo Hernandez and injuring several others. Following the attack at LAX, this committee passed the Gerardo Hernandez Airport Security Act of 2015, which President Obama signed into law. The act made important security improvements, including directing airports and high-risk surface transportation systems to install incident response plans and requiring TSA to provide active shooter training to all its screening personnel. These measures have improved security, but unfortunately, threats to transportation have not dissipated. Since the shooting in LAX, attacks have occurred in surface systems or public airports in New Orleans, Fort Lauderdale, and New York City, as well as several other locations overseas. It's time to build upon the Gerardo Hernandez Act and take the next step in securing soft targets within the transportation sector. My bill, the Strengthening Local Transportation Security Capabilities Act of 2018, enhances security in 3 ways. First, it requires DHS to prioritize the assignment of officers and intelligence analysts to state, local, and regional fusion centers in jurisdictions with a high-risk surface transportation asset. The assignment of such officers and analysts would ensure that intelligence relating to threats against surface transportation is shared with appropriate stakeholders in a timely manner, improving the chances of preventing the next terror attack. Second, my bill directs TSA to provide stakeholders a framework for establishing integrated and unified operation centers responsible for overseeing daily operations of transportation facilities. The shooting at LAX displayed the confusion that an attack can create, as first responders were prevented from administering first aid to victims for over half an hour because the terminal had not been declared safe to enter, even though the shooter had been neutralized within 5 minutes. A central operations center could have reduced the confusion among all the various authorities operating at the airport. Finally, my bill authorizes DHS to develop a training program to enhance the protection, preparedness, and response capabilities of law enforcement agencies that operate a surface transportation assets. Taken together, these provisions enhance the capabilities of local transportation security stakeholders to both prevent and respond to terrorist attacks and other serious incidents. I thank my colleagues for supporting this bill, and in particular, Ms. Watson-Coleman for her leadership on these issues. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Generally yields back. Any other member seek recognition? Mr. Katko is recognized.
This one's my turn? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. America's transportation sector has long been and continues to be a top target for terrorism. In addition to persistent threat to aviation, terrorists continue to see surface transportation modes as soft targets, which can yield high numbers of casualties. As chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security, I've held numerous hearings, briefings, and roundtables dedicated to providing congressional oversight of TSA's role in surface transportation security. In addition to a number of horrific attacks against surface targets by terrorists overseas, we recently experienced an attempted suicide bombing at New York's Port Authority and bus and train terminal. This attack represented the first suicide bombing attempt that was carried out on American soil ever. Luckily, this incident only yielded injury to the would-be suicide bomber. However, it served as an important reminder and a sober reminder that we must be prepared to respond to threats in all modes of transportation and all types of threats attributed thereto. While TSA is responsible for securing all of America's transportation systems, surface transportation security has been consistently overshadowed by the amount of attention and resources dedicated to aviation security. This imbalance is aptly demonstrated by the glaring absence of surface transportation in TSA's mandated 5-year technology investment plan, as well as the biennial refresh. The Surface Transportation Security and Technology Accountability Act of 2018 will directly address this imbalance by strengthening the viability and visibility of the surface transportation sector. This bill authorizes the establishment of a Surface Transportation Security Advisory Committee to provide stakeholders the opportunity to coordinate with TSA and comment on policy and pending regulations. We have a similar thing in the aviation sector called the ASAC, or Aviation Security Advisory Committee, and it has spawned many helpful and useful pieces of legislation and has caused industry to be far more interactive with Homeland Security and with this committee. Additionally, this bill explicitly directs TSA to expand the scope of its technology investment plan to incorporate investments related to surface transportation security and air cargo security. H.R. 5081 will signal to TSA that this committee takes its oversight of all transportation modes seriously, and that the security of surface transportation modes should be a high priority for the agency. I would like to thank, as always, the ranking member of the Transportation Protective Security Committee, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for co-sponsoring this legislation and for her dedication to securing all modes of transportation. We have done many roundtables and hearings together on this matter, and she's been a leader in that regard. Whether we are talking about mass transit, passenger rail, buses, trucking, freight rail, or pipelines, surface transportation is of critical importance to all of our committees, including my home district in Central New York. For that reason, I urge all of my committee colleagues to support the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to state my support for Mr. Katko's bill, H.R. 5081. This bill requires TSA to establish the Surface Transportation Security Advisory Committee, similar to the Aviation Security Advisory Committee that currently exists. Such an advisory committee would be a welcome addition and help garner surface security the attention it deserves. In addition, the bill would direct TSA to include surface security technologies in updates to its technology investment plan. Mr. Katko's bill complements my surface transportation bill, and I thank him for his collaboration and his leadership on these issues. I would also like to state my support for Ms. Berrigan's bill, H.R. 5089. I was pleased to collaborate with Ms. Berrigan on this bill to help improve surface transportation security by supporting local stakeholder security force efforts. I thank her for her work and for her leadership, and I urge my colleagues to support the bills, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Jill A. yields back. Let me just commend both Mr. Katko and Ms. Watson-Coleman for your excellent work on this subcommittee. As everybody, I think, on this committee knows, there's a very alarming threat to our aviation sector. Not to get into the classified space, but involving explosive devices and gases. We on this committee have a responsibility and oversight of the administration. The TSA administrator testified that after we had some very, I think, strong discussions with them, that we have technology available today that could detect this. Rather than X-ray machines, we can use computed tomography, which is like going from an X-ray to an MRI. The technology is there, and yet there was a failure to deploy that technology. And part of that failure was money. But I personally, and I think I speak for everyone on this committee, do not want to see Americans blown up in the skies on an airplane, inbound or outbound, because of a failure of this administration not to take this threat seriously. The request was made by the TSA administrator for 300 of these new technology machines. The OMB cut that request in half to 150. We are simply talking about a difference of $75 million versus $150 million to protect Americans in the skies. To me, that's a worthwhile investment, and I stand on the record. I think I speak for everyone on this committee that we stand in support of the full appropriation. I've scheduled a meeting with the chairman of the Appropriations Committee in a classified setting on this threat to make sure that he understands that. So as we work towards the omnibus bill in the next several weeks, that we will include the full funding for all 300 machines so that we on this committee can say that we did everything within our power to protect the American people. With that, I yield back, and the chair recognizes Mr. Katko again.
Yeah, just to respond briefly to what you're saying, you're exactly right. And Ms. Watson-Coleman, myself, and others led a congressional delegation to Europe, and the technology that we're contemplating is already being implemented on the front lines in some airports in Europe. And it's an American company that has a technology, an American company that has sold that technology to our counterparts elsewhere. So it exists. It's already being implemented. Any delays in implementing it are shameful in my mind, and it should be put on the front lines immediately. So the need for this is incredibly important given the advancement in technology by the bad guys. And so I strongly support what you're saying, and I hope that the appropriators understand the importance of getting this technology implemented as soon as possible.
I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and again, this is one of those issues that's not Republican, Democrat. It's just it's an American issue. And thank you, Ms. Watson-Coleman, and I recognize you as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate this, and I appreciate this committee, because I think we do work on a bipartisan basis to ensure that our homeland is safe. I think that we have to remember to raise the issues as they relate to the funding of surface transportation issues. The grants have been, the proposal for the grants has been reduced, and there are other areas that have been reduced that represent serious opportunities for soft targets to have harmful outcomes in this country. And so I support everything that we propose to do to make aviation travel safer, but I need us to wrap around our brains how significant surface transportation issues and challenges are, because they're so easily targeted. So with that, I yield back. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for your comments. I was on the train to the Greenbrier that was, suddenly, abruptly stopped in a very awful tragedy, and we saw that firsthand. And I think the threat of this poisonous gas that's out there as well, from what we saw from the Australian plot, could be a devastating event on any of our Amtrak trains throughout the nation. And so with that, the chair now recognizes Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 5099, the Enhancing DHS Fusion Center Technology Assistant Program Act. Since 9/11, states and major urban areas have established fusion centers as an avenue for greater collaboration between federal, state, and local governments with regards to terrorism information sharing. These state and locally owned fusion centers have largely evolved from terrorism-focused centers to all crimes, all hazard centers, working on a range of relevant Homeland Security issues, including terrorism, cybersecurity, and even the opioid crisis. I had the privilege of visiting our state's Fusion Center recently. I was impressed with the work the Kansas Intelligence Fusion Center, KIFC, is doing, and I want to ensure the department is fully supporting these centers and the national network. In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security created a Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program to provide Fusion Centers with assistance on a range of topics, including suspicious activity reporting and other relevant trainings. Last year, committee staff, under the direction of Chairman McCall, conducted a year-long review of the national network of Fusion Centers and its relationship with the department. The findings in these reports echo information I have received, particularly related to the DHS Technical Assistance Program. The program is not living up to its potential. At a time when terrorists are changing tactics and the threats are evolving, we need to ensure the department is providing Fusion Centers with the technical assistance needed to protect our communities. The bill provides a formal authorization for the program and a clear set of directives on the services to be provided by the program, including assistance related to available grant funding and the DHS terrorism prevention programs, as well as intelligence and information sharing. The bill further expands the role of the program to include being a repository of best practices relevant to Fusion Centers, including cybersecurity. I heard directly from the Kansas Intelligence Fusion Center about the need for more information sharing and training related to cybersecurity, and the bill makes this a priority. This is a common sense bill that should help strengthen the nation's ability to prevent and protect against terrorist acts and other Homeland Security related events. I urge all my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 4176, H.R. 5094, H.R. 5131, H.R. 5079, H.R. 4227, and H.R. 4467 be considered without objection. So ordered. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4176, H.R. 5094, H.R. 5131, H.R. 5079, H.R. 4227, H.R. 4467.
Without objection, readings dispensed with. Respective subcommittees are discharged. Bills and amendments are circulated in advance. Printed copies that were made available. I ask unanimous consent that the amendments pre-filed listed on the roster and included in the members' packets be adopted. Are there any additional amendments to any of these bills? Hearing none, I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 4176, H.R. 5094, H.R. 5131, H.R. 5079, H.R. 4227, and H.R. 4467 be ordered to be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation as amended without objection. So ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Without objection, Mr. Thompson, Mr. King, Mr. Watson Coleman, Ms. Watson Coleman, excuse me, and Mr. Bacon may each be recognized for 5 minutes on their legislation, and Mr. Donovan, Mr. Katko, Ms. Rice may be recognized for 5 minutes on their amendments. Does any member seek recognition? Mr. King is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Suspicious activity reporting, SARS, and see something, say something, became cornerstone concepts in the days, weeks, and months and years after 9/11, and they're now common security vernacular for the majority of Americans. These two programs help to, quote-unquote, connect the dots by identifying potentially radicalized individuals and preventing acts of terror. It is incumbent on the Department of Homeland Security and partner agencies at all levels of government to continue to reinforce this message. It is vital that we not fall into complacency, and that is the true objective I had in drafting H.R. 5094, the Enhancing Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative. While the FBI reviews nationwide SARS for investigative leads, DHS largely manages the effort to provide information and training to state and local law enforcement, fusion centers, and other emergency response providers. In order to maintain and improve SARS training for these vital stakeholders, as well as the private sector, this bill requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to convene a working group for a 2-year period to provide recommendations and feedback to the Department. The working group must be comprised of state and local stakeholders, the private sector, and privacy experts. The bill further requires the Secretary to utilize the working group to develop a strategy on improving overall SARS training and information sharing activities across the department. The measure also includes language requested by committee Democrats to include additional provisions regarding civil liberty safeguards. During a hearing held last fall, by my subcommittee, DHS testified that in the past 7 years, more than 100,000 SARs have been submitted, 1,200 of which initiated a new investigation or enhanced an existing one. Additionally, over 1,000 SARs led to terrorism watch list enhancements. One real-life example of alert community members and law enforcement occurred in New Jersey. One hearing witness described how police responded to a SAR in February 2017, and during the course of the investigation, a copy of Inspire magazine was found, in particular an article on how to construct a pressure cooker bomb. The subject admitted to planning a Boston Marathon-style attack in New York City. This SAR was instrumental in thwarting a potential terrorist attack against our nation. There's also the well-known case of the alert Times Square vendor back in, I guess it was 2010, who notified police about a suspicious smoking vehicle and prevented a potentially deadly bombing. At the same time, there have been instances where citizens did not report suspicious behavior, or law enforcement did not take sufficient steps to follow up on the tip. Reinvigorating DHS's focus on SARS training and outreach is essential and the goal of this bill. After an attack or tragedy in our nation, leaders of both parties highlight the need for first responders and citizens to be vigilant, and they always reiterate the see something, say something message. I hope we will see bipartisan support for this bill and to ensure that law enforcement have a voice in enhancing the process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I urge support for the bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Thompson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, 13 years ago, the 9/11 Commission expressed concerns regarding the screening and transport of checked bags and cargo, and called for more attention and resources to be directed to reducing or mitigating the threats posed by explosive in vessels' cargo holds. Progress on air cargo security was achieved in 2007 with the enactment of the 9/11 Commission Recommendations Act, but today the threat of a terrorist attack using air cargo is significant. In fact, in July 2017, then Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly identified cargo-based aviation attacks as a major concern, explaining there are very sophisticated people who do nothing but try to figure out how to blow up an airplane in flight. He went on to say that there's a fair amount of cargo, what we would attribute to just cargo flown on passenger airplanes, on space available. Terrorists are constantly looking for ways to do this. That same month, on July 15th, Australian authorities charged 4 men with plotting to detonate a bomb to bring down a passenger plane on behalf of ISIS. The Australian plot came 7 years after a terrorist plot to ship bombs hidden in printer cartridges from Yemen to the United States on board cargo planes was thwarted. The increased risk to air cargo comes at a time when the volume of goods being moved by air cargo has increased, with 2016 volumes back to approximately 98.4% of pre-recession levels, with airlines transporting 52 million metric tons of goods. I introduced the Air Cargo Security Improvement Act to drive TSA to enhance its air cargo security efforts by moving more aggressively toward addressing current and future threats to air cargo. Specifically, H.R. 4176 seeks to better position TSA to carry out its air cargo security responsibilities, encourage further technological developments for air cargo screening, and improve TSA's cargo security program. I'm pleased that the committee passed my amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4176 that reflects feedback from TSA and the majority to make Americans more secure from the threats of an air cargo-based terrorist attack. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Throughout this Congress, I have sounded the alarm on the need to improve the security of surface transportation systems, including passenger and freight trains, commuter rail, mass transit buses, and pipelines. Last November, I introduced H.R. 4474, the Surface Transportation and Public Area Security Act of 2017, to enhance the security of these critical systems. Less than 2 weeks later, a would-be suicide attacker confirmed the immediacy of the threat, riding the subway from Brooklyn to the Port Authority bus terminal with a bomb strapped to his chest before detonating it near Times Square. Fortunately, the bomber was the only person seriously injured, but the lesson is clear. We must secure these systems before a mass casualty attack occurs. Unfortunately, the President continues to turn a blind eye to this issue, as this year's budget request somehow manages to be worse than last year's. This year, the President is proposing devastating cuts to the Transit Security Grant Program and a full elimination of the Visible Intermodal Prevention and Response Program. Dismantling the few programs aimed at securing service transportation security in the face of such a clear and present threat would be a dereliction of duty. I remain hopeful, however, that this committee will fight against such cuts by passing H.R. 4474, which would fully restore these programs. In the meantime, I appreciate my colleagues' support for H.R. 5131, the Surface Transportation Security Improvement Act of 2018, and for H.R. 5089, Ms. Barragan's bill, both of which contain key provisions from H.R. 4474. H.R. 5131 requires DHS to develop risk-based priorities across all transportation modes, explain overdue surface transportation security rulemakings, disseminate best practices for securing transportation systems against the threat of vehicle-based attacks, and conduct a feasibility assessment of introducing next-generation technologies to detect threats to surface transportation systems. It authorizes a TSA task force to develop innovative technologies for both surface and aviation security, and it directs DHS to assess the threats posed by the use of technologies developed or manufactured by firms closely linked to countries known to pose a cyber or homeland security threat. Finally, my bill directs DHS to conduct a survey of service transportation stakeholders regarding resource challenges, including the availability of federal funding and specific unmet needs, which will help highlight the extent to which current funding falls short. In sum, my bill enhances surface transportation security across a range of activities. This legislation is sorely needed, and I thank my colleagues for their support. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Generally yields back. Mr. Bacon is recognized on his first bill to come out of this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a privilege to be able to submit H.R. 5079, which is the Department of Homeland Security Field Engagement Accountability Act. Improving information sharing throughout the government and entities is at the forefront of our lessons learned since 9/11. Over the years, fusion centers have cemented their role in the nation's counter-terrorism mission, facilitating greater information sharing and analysis, and connecting those on the front lines with the federal partners across all levels of government. This committee's longstanding and rigorous oversight of federal support to state and local law enforcement continues to reinforce the vital role played by our fusion centers. We continue to see examples of the important roles they play, from providing critical information that helped identify Tashfeen Malik in the immediate aftermath of the San Bernardino terror attack, to issuing timely and vetted situation updates to law enforcement nationwide during the Pulse nightclub shooting, to spearheading intra-agency threat assessments of mass gatherings, such as the College World Series in my district. I recently visited the Nebraska Information Analysis Center, known as the NIAC, and saw firsthand the hard work and commitment from these partners to help protect our nation from another terrorist attack. I also heard about the critical role DHS plays in integrating NIAC information into the Homeland Security information sharing environment. While DHS has made strides in its role as the chief advocate for fusion centers, I and others on this committee have found that additional strategic guidance is needed department-wide to maintain this positive momentum and further unify and strengthen the department's engagement with these stakeholders. Similarly, appropriate metrics to gauge progress and ensure accountability are also necessary to effectively implement these plans. To address these gaps, I introduced the DHS Field Engagement Accountability Act to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to develop a DHS-wide fusion center engagement strategy and ensure metrics are in place to hold field personnel from the Office of Intelligence and Analysis accountable for their performance at fusion centers. This bill also calls for enhancements to the unclassified and classified systems DHS provides to fusion centers for sharing information. This is a common sense bill to bolster Department of Homeland Security programs and policies to enhance the DHS relationship with state and local fusion centers across the country. I want to thank Mr. Bill Keating, a bipartisan co-sponsor on this bill and one of the originals. I'm grateful for him making this a bipartisan effort. Bottom line, we have a great program of fusion centers, 70 of them across our country, but we can do better. We can hold higher standards, we can standardize, we can assist on better training, and get better performance from all 70. With that, sir, or Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
No, thank you, Mr. Bacon. I think not only are fusion centers critical with countering terrorism, but also as we see the threat of human and sex trafficking playing more and more of a vital role in that process. And I was proud that this committee got the Blue Campaign passed and signed into law by the President just a couple weeks ago. Now, with that, Chair recognizes Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would first like to voice my support for the DHS Field Engagement Accountability Act. The underlying bill directs DHS to develop a department-wide engagement strategy with fusion centers, something that I believe is necessary for the continued success of our fusion centers. This bill will continue to strengthen the information sharing platform between DHS and state and local governments, and will allow us to assess and understand new threats so we can respond to them in a responsible and effective manner. My amendment would require DHS to submit a report to the respective House and Senate Homeland Security Committees about the status of implementation of the requirements in the Act. This report will help Congress understand if the new DHS-wide fusion center strategy is operating as intended and promote thoughtful engagement between DHS and Congress. I thank my colleagues for supporting my amendment and the underlying bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Donovan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4227, the Vehicular Terrorism Prevention Act. As the DHS Deputy Secretary Elaine Duke testified before the committee last year, the threats to our nation from terrorist groups are serious and more dispersed. Rather than solely focusing on recruiting people to join the fight overseas, terrorist organizations like ISIS are encouraging extremists to commit terrorist acts in their homeland by any means necessary. In fact, in September of 2014, now deceased ISIS senior leader Abu Muhammad al-Adnani urged these attacks, stating, "Smash his head with a rock, or slaughter him with a knife, or run him over with your car, or throw him down from a high place, or choke him, or poison him." We have seen the use of vehicles in attacks on Westerners in Nice, London, Barcelona, Israel, and my hometown of New York City, where a terrorist killed 8 people and injured 13 others on Halloween in the name of ISIS. Security experts have noted that this tactic has gained popularity because it is unsophisticated and requires little to no advanced training. As we see this method of attack being utilized with more frequency, we must look for creative solutions to prevent this type of terrorism. My amendment requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to develop a strategy to assist state and local law enforcement and first responders in their efforts to combat this horrific threat through information sharing activities and training. We must do everything we can to prevent, mitigate, and respond to these threats. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Bacon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to thank Ms. Rice for her amendment and say it's a welcome addition, and I would support the amendment as well to the bill I proposed. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Katko is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. TSA's risk management strategy for passenger aviation security is characterized by a multi-layered approach, whereby TSA simultaneously deploys a variety of security countermeasures to deter and detect threats. Federal Air Marshals, also known as FAMs, are armed law enforcement officers who are deployed on passenger flights as a part of TSA's multi-layered security strategy to protect airline passengers and crew against criminals and terrorists. Due to the high volume of passenger flights and limited resources at TSA, it is imperative that FAM's deployment is risk-based and strategic in order to achieve the greatest security value. However, GAO reported in September 2017 that TSA does not measure data on the effectiveness and deterrence value of FAMs. Without viable metrics, it is impossible for TSA to truly employ a calculated risk management strategy for passenger aviation security. Accordingly, the Strengthening Aviation Security Act of 2017 requires the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize risk-based strategies when allocating resources for international and domestic flight coverage. This bill ensures that FAMs are deployed in a manner that adds categorical value to TSA's multi-layered security approach. My amendment requires TSA to take their risk-based approach a step further by ensuring that FAMs are seated in tactical positions when deployed on aircraft. Strategic seating arrangements will provide FAMs with a distinct advantage in the event of a threat to aviation security and ensure that they are more relevant to the important mission which they are tasked. I urge all of my committee colleagues to support this bill and my amendment. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. This concludes the consideration of the bills by the committee for today. I do want to let the members of the committee know that I sent a letter yesterday to the Secretary of Homeland Security requesting a classified briefing for the members of this committee on the cybersecurity threats facing our state election systems, voter registration databases, and internet-connected election infrastructure. I hope we will get that briefing soon, and then it is my intention to hold a public hearing on the issue.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson's recognized.
To kind of wrap up some of the comments we had in the beginning, I want to kind of say the three things that we kind of agreed on. That we look at a hearing on election security consistent with the briefing that you just talked about now. Once you get feedback on the Donovan bill from the department, we'll come back for consideration. Mr. Payne has sent a letter to you asking for a field hearing on school security, and I'd like for you to take those three items under consideration so that we can move forward, because the school security issue is something that if we, as a committee, would, I think, look at, we could do some real good.
I completely agree with the gentleman. I think that's something this committee should be looking at. It is a Homeland Security issue. Of course, we have jurisdictional challenges at times, but I do think it is obviously a very important issue. As a father of 5 children in public schools, I fully agree with that, and we will work together as we usually do on this committee. So with that, Mr. Katko is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1 of the Rules of the House, I move that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the bills ordered, reported by this committee today, or on similar Senate bills.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking members recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
Without objection, so ordered. We passed 10 bills today. I believe that this committee has passed 74 bills out of this committee. 6 have been signed into public law, and the rest of them are languishing in the Senate. I hope that the Senate will at least mark up the reauthorization bill. I understand they're in the process of that, which we worked so hard on this committee with 7 other committee chairmen under the leadership of the Speaker to get accomplished. Not to do so would be a dereliction of duty, I believe, on the behalf of our Article I powers under the Constitution that Congress has. So with that, this committee now stands adjourned.